Every single criminal in the story did something genuinely impressive. They recruited carefully, studied their targets, and when the moment came, they pulled it off. And then in the aftermath, each one of them made one small avoidable mistake that handed everything to the police. These were plans that actually worked out, but were riddled with moments of stupidity that made sure none of it mattered. And the embarrassment, as you'll see, only gets worse as we go. Case number 1. The Aqueduct Racetrack Heist, New York City, March 7, 2020. Lafayette Morrison had been a security guard at Aqueduct Racetrack in South Ozone Park, Queens for long enough to know exactly how the place worked. With that knowledge, he saw an opportunity. Every night, 2 employees worked a money collection route, moving through the racetrack, emptying self-serve betting machines and loading the bundled cash into a wheeled cart. When the route was done, they crossed a restricted catwalk and took a private elevator down to the vault in the basement. Morrison knew the catwalk had no security cameras, and that it was the point in the route where the cart was at its fullest. He had, in other words, identified the perfect place for a robbery at the perfect moment to commit it. He shared the plan with his childhood friend Larnell Miller, who would handle the gun, and Miller brought in a third man, Khalil Williams, to drive the getaway car and serve as backup. The date they chose was March 7th, 2020, Gotham Stakes Night, the racetrack's biggest and most lucrative event of the year, a Kentucky Derby prep race that drew enormous betting volume. That evening, the track took in $536,000. The 3-year-old colt Mischievous Alex won the race. Shortly afterwards, the crew moved. The day before the robbery, Williams had driven to a Metro PCS store in Queens and bought 2 burner phones and an earpiece, registering them under a fake name at the address of a nearby Chinese restaurant. He picked up a black Mercedes for the getaway. On the night itself, Morrison worked his regular shift as if nothing were planned. Miller and Williams entered through a side entrance and found a key Morrison had hidden beneath a seat cushion and concealed themselves at a storage area to wait. Morrison left his phone line open to Miller so Miller could hear him in real time as he escorted the collectors through the route. At 10:01 in the evening, the last machine was emptied. The cart was as full as it was going to get. Miller and Williams stepped out of the stairwell, blocked the path of the collectors on the catwalk, told them to freeze, and held them at gunpoint. Williams took all of their phones and put them in a bag. Miller told the workers to turn around, go back to a storage closet, and count to 1,000 before coming out. Williams wrapped the cart in a black bag and the 2 of them walked out, and Morrison returned to work and reported the robbery as a victim. Later that night in Miller's hotel room and Miller's girlfriend present, they counted the money 5 times over the course of several hours. The loot came out to $284,866. Miller kept $100,000 for himself. Williams kept $100,000, and $84,000 was set aside for Morrison. So far, this was a clean and well-executed plan. But here's where it comes apart. Williams had been given one specific job as he left the building: dump the victim's phone in a trash can on the way out. And he did that. What he also dumped, apparently, without realizing it, was Morrison's burner phone, the one that had been on an open line to Miller throughout the entire robbery. That phone was never supposed to leave the crew's possession. Police found it in the trash, pulled the call logs, and then used cell tower data to trace its movements throughout the day. The burner had been traveling in perfect tandem with Morrison's personal phone since that morning, from his home neighborhood all the way to the racetrack. From one phone in a trash can, investigators had identified their inside man. The second mistake was Miller's, which was made the night before the heist while the 3 of them were going over the plan. At some point in that meeting, Miller accidentally called Morrison's burner phone from his own personal cell phone. That number was already in a police database from a prior arrest, and it matched the mugshot that lined up with the surveillance footage of a man in a black hat and camo pants walking into Aqueduct on the night of March 7th and never coming back out. Morrison and Miller were arrested on June 15th, 2020, 14 weeks after the heist. Williams stayed unidentified for over a year, in part because Morrison and Miller refused to name him. At a trial in Brooklyn in October 2022, Morrison and Miller were both convicted. Miller was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, while Morrison received 7.5 years, having been found guilty on robbery, conspiracy, brandishing a firearm, and obstruction of justice. Williams, who had cooperated with prosecutors and testified against the others, was sentenced to time served and released, though the court ordered him to pay back the full $284,860. Case number 2. The $1 million ATM cash heist, Toronto, April 1st, 2021. There's a type of business that operates in almost complete anonymity in most cities. The company that stocks and services privately owned ATM machines. These businesses hold enormous amounts of cash in commercial units that look entirely unremarkable from the outside, and they do not advertise what they do. For most people passing by on any given day, they're invisible. For someone with the right information, they're extraordinarily attractive targets. This particular business sat near Carlingview Drive and Dixon Road, just outside Toronto Pearson International Airport, tucked into a stretch of industrial buildings that attracted no special attention from anyone. On April 1st, 2021, two masked and armed men decided to take it. Just before 9 in the morning, they ambushed a female employee in the parking lot as she was arriving for work, forced her at gunpoint at the front door, and pushed inside. They grabbed the manager and moved toward the cash room, where the vaults, as it turned out, had been left unlocked. The room was lined on three sides with heavy-duty safes, stacked with bundled cash and sealed bags of currency, more money than either man had probably ever seen in one place. One of them had brought a bag for exactly this purpose, but in the chaos, he set it down somewhere and could not find it again. He tried a small shelf bag, realized immediately it was nowhere near large enough, and eventually pulled the liner out of a garbage can and started filling it with bundled cash instead. By the time they left, under 5 minutes after forcing their way in, the bag was so heavy and the plastic so thin that he had to drag it out the front door. Toronto police named the investigation Project Heavy Bag. The total came to more than $1 million. They got away, and then they made the mistake that ended everything. Emmanuel Rawson of Toronto, aged 22, who police would later allege was one of the two men inside the cash house, kept a significant portion of the stolen money at his home address. 6 weeks after the heist, on May 17th, armed suspects attempted a home invasion at that address. The intruders fled when police were called, but officers who arrived to check on the residence found approximately $160,000 in cash inside the unit. Investigators traced it to the April 1st robbery, and from that single loose thread, the entire case unraveled. Search warrants executed at homes and vehicles over the following weeks turned up 8 handguns, high-capacity drum magazines, body armor, ammunition, and 330 grams of cocaine. Among those arrested was Philip Nkrumah, 36, a former All-Star college basketball player who had once been named the top defensive player in Canadian university basketball. He's not alleged to have been one of the two men inside the building during the heist, but he was charged with firearms and drug offenses connected to the investigation. Rawson himself was not found when police first came looking. He was eventually listed as number 23 on Canada's BOLO 25 Most Wanted list in April of 2022 and was arrested 3 days after the list was published. Case number 3, the Chester Lake Crew Ram Raids, Toronto, 2019. Now, to understand both how well this next crew planned their heists and how badly things eventually went for them, it helps to understand who they were. The Chester Lake Crew, whose publicly named members included Kennedy Richards Coleman, Omer Garbzada, Mohammed Aden, Fayaz Alakuzi, and Shadab Nabizada, took its name from a street and housing complex in Scarborough, Toronto, where its core members grew up together. By the time of these events, they were an established criminal organization involved in gun trafficking, drug dealing, and gang violence, with investigators having linked them to members of the Italian mafia at the top of Toronto's underworld hierarchy. When they decided to start hitting jewelry stores, they brought the same organizational discipline to those operations. Investigators had also linked them to members of traditional organized crime, which in Toronto means the Italian mafia. Intelligence had led investigators to believe that members of the Chester Lake gang and their associates had been involved in numerous violent incidents and activities over the previous 4 years, including attempted murder, firearms offenses, drug trafficking, and multiple robberies. These were not amateurs, and they were not operating under the radar. Project Kraken was an 8-month investigation led by the Major Projects Section of the Integrated Gun and Gang Task Force. It had been quietly building its case long before the jewelry heist even happened, and by the time the crew started hitting stores, police were already deep inside their operation. Early in the morning on the day of the heist, they parked their cars directly in front of the target to hold the spaces. Hours later, once the plaza was busy, they swapped them out for a stolen Dodge Durango and a stolen tow truck and waited. A few minutes before the raid, a crew member drove 8 miles to a beauty salon and fired shots into the ceiling to pull police patrols away from the target. When they were satisfied the window had opened, the tow truck reversed at full speed into the storefront. 4 men climbed out of the Durango, hammers in hand, and cleared the display cases. The Brampton raid lasted under 60 seconds and netted $276,000 in jewelry. This was supposed to be a clean-cut job, but one mistake changed everything. After each job, the crew met at a clubhouse they called The Shop on Crockford Boulevard in Scarborough to divide the proceeds. What they did not know was that the shop was already under covert police surveillance with a wiretap running as part of a wider guns and gangs investigation. They were holding their post-heist meetings inside a building that police had already turned into an observation post. When officers moved in, part of the crew bolted through the rear driveway. One man got snagged on the barbed wire fence at the back, discarded his pants to pull himself free, and kept running. Left behind were a wallet with one man's full identification, a loaded gun caught in the wire, and his abandoned trousers. Project Kraken was executed in June 2019, with 700 officers from 12 police agencies carrying out 99 warrants across the Greater Toronto area. 73 people were charged with 599 criminal offenses. Kennedy Richards Coleman was sentenced to 6.5 years. Omer Garbzada received 7. Some of those charged contested their cases in court, and the allegations against them have not been proven. Case number 4, the $22.5 million airport gold heist, Toronto 2023. On April 17, 2023, an Air Canada flight from Zurich landed at Toronto Pearson International Airport carrying approximately 6,600 gold bars. Just under 400 kilograms refined to 0.9999 purity, along with roughly $2.5 million in foreign currency, all destined for one of Canada's major banks via a Brinks Armor delivery that evening. At 6:32, a man in a safety vest, hat, glasses, medical mask, and heavy work gloves reversed a plain white 5-ton truck into a loading bay. He handed the staff an airway bill printed on genuine Air Canada paper from inside the warehouse. It listed 1,200 kilograms of seafood from Scotland and had already been released the day before. Nobody questioned it. A forklift loaded the gold into the truck and the driver left. Brink arrived at 9:30 and found nothing. Police were not called until 2:43 in the morning, giving the crew more than an 8-hour head start. 2 Air Canada employees were named among the accused. Simranpreet Patazar, 31, was the cargo manager who reportedly gave police their guided tour of the crime scene in the aftermath, then resigned, left Canada for Punjab, India, and has not been found since. A Canada-wide arrest warrant was issued. As of 2025, he remains a fugitive. However, even though the theft seemed flawlessly executed, small mistakes eventually caught up with the thief. The first mistake was a single fingerprint. The driver removed his left work glove for a moment to handle paperwork and left one print behind. It identified him as Durante King McLean of Brampton, age 25. Police found his truck, but not King McLean. 5 months later, a Pennsylvania state trooper pulled him over for swerving at a darkly tinted window. He ran and was caught, and in the trunk were 65 handguns, 2 modified to fire fully automatically, 11 stolen, and 1 with an obliterated serial number. The next mistake was the most brazen. Parmpal Sidhu, 54, a cargo employee also charged in the case. He spent the months after the heist posting infinity pool photos, first-class boarding passes, expensive watches, 2 trips to Dubai on Instagram and Facebook. On his way out of Pearson Airport for the second trip, he captioned it "one last trip to close off a wonderful year." Dubai is one of the world's most active markets for undocumented gold. 9 people were charged in Canada. Of the more than $22 million in gold and cash stolen, only around $90,000 worth has ever been recovered. Case number 5, the Corrupt Cops Cannabis Heist, Los Angeles, October 29, 2018. Every case in this story involves someone who made one mistake after an otherwise intelligent plan. However, Mark Antrim's mistake was not one thing, it was the entire premise. Antrim was a 43-year-old deputy with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, assigned to the Temple City Station, and on the night of October 29, 2018, he was off duty. He'd apparently robbed street drug dealers before, using his badge to intimidate them and take their product in cash. The kind of target has no lawyers, no files, no reports, and doesn't call the police. It is, from a certain criminal perspective, low risk. His new target operated in an entirely different world, and it seems he had not thought through what that meant. He chose Steezy, a 6,500 square foot legal marijuana storage and retail warehouse in downtown LA, less than a mile from LAPD headquarters. California had legalized adult use cannabis earlier that year, and because the industry had difficulty accessing conventional banking, many facilities held large cash reserves on site. Steezy was one of the largest operations of its kind in the state. Antrim wore his real LASD uniform, his real duty belt, his real badge, and carried his real firearm. He also drove a Ford Explorer that he collected from the sheriff's station. His 2 accomplices were dressed as law enforcement officers, one of them carrying a shotgun. His inside man was Christopher Myung Kim, age 31, a former Steezy employee who had left after a dispute with the owners and, in the course of settling that grievance, provided Antrim with blueprints of the facility, security schedules, staffing details, and a specific identification of which room held the most valuable product. A lookout was stationed outside, communicating with the crew by walkie-talkie. At 3:11 in the morning, Antrim pulled up to the gate, showed his badge and a fake search warrant, and was led inside. He detained the security guards and locked them in the rear cage of his department vehicle. When a rented Penske truck arrived at 3:21, the loading began. 20 minutes later, the lookout came over the radio. Someone had called the real police. LAPD patrol officers arrived at 3:43 to investigate suspicious activity. Antrim's crew stripped off their fake sheriff's jackets and fled out the back. Antrim walked calmly to the front gate to greet the officers, told them he was running a narcotic search warrant for the sheriff's drug squad, and at one point pulled out his phone, said he was calling a sergeant, and handed it to an LAPD officer to speak with the man on the other end. There was no sergeant. The LAPD left at 4:16. Satisfied that a colleague was handling his business, Antrim called his crew back. They loaded 2 5-foot commercial safes containing $645,000 in cash and money orders, along with approximately $1.5 million in marijuana product, into the Penske truck. By 5 in the morning, Antrim had released the staff, climbed back into the department vehicle, and driven away with an estimated $2 million stolen. What Antrim did not take into account was that California state law requires licensed marijuana facilities to maintain extensive and continuous security surveillance. Steezy had 32 cameras covering the entire property, and every one of them had been running all night. The warehouse's lawyers contacted the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to inquire about the warrant. When the LASD sergeant reviewed the security footage, he recognized Deputy Antrim without any difficulty. Antrim was arrested 10 days later. He had committed a $2 million armed robbery inside a building that was legally required to have cameras everywhere while wearing his own uniform, carrying his own badge, and driving his own department's vehicle. He did not disguise himself or use a fake name. He handed his real phone to a police officer in the middle of the heist and asked him to speak to a fake colleague. And then he drove the department's car back to wherever he had borrowed it from, apparently satisfied that it had all gone rather well. Antrim pleaded guilty to 5 felony charges and cooperated with prosecutors against his co-conspirators. He was sentenced on April 12, 2021 to 7 years in federal prison. Kim, who had provided the blueprint for the entire operation, was convicted at trial and sentenced to a minimum of 12 years in federal prison plus a $500,000 fine. 6 other co-conspirators were also convicted. U.S. District Judge Virginia Phillips told the court that the case eroded the public's trust in law enforcement, which, given everything, was putting it gently.